nice to see you, Rachel. Welcome to Coffee with Climate Leaders.
Well, it's nice to see you, Amy, and you've got the flowers and the fruit perfectly positioned behind you. I'm very impressed.
Wonderful. This is my dining room. This is my work from home spot. So, and I love your background as well. I can't wait to catch up with you. We last saw each other at the Climate Leadership Conference in March, where we both served on a panel on subnational action at the international level to address climate change. And you were a great participant on that panel, and especially with the background that you bring to that subject matter. You're now the 14th Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and I think the first woman in that position. Great. And prior to joining Fletcher, you served as Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary and General and Chief Executive Officer of Sustainable Energy for All. Before that, you were the World Bank Group Vice President and Special Envoy for Climate Change, leading the Bank Group's effort to shift its operations and campaign for the Paris Agreement. So March, when we saw each other in person, it now seems like a lifetime ago. And back in the spring, there were starting to be a lot of comparisons made between the challenges of combating COVID and climate change. And now that we're more than 8 months into this global pandemic, what are the real lessons learned about COVID that can be applied to addressing the climate crisis?
Oh, well, Amy, it's a great question. It's lovely to be with you. And yeah, that was the last trip I made. That was the last flight I took, because I think it was like March the 4th or something. And we sent all our students home the next week. So actually, it was very much on my mind that day as we started to go through the planning. So I think that a couple of things, a couple of touch points between the COVID crisis and sort of the climate crisis. First of all, is they're both what I would call grey rhinos. Now, I didn't invent that term, but a grey rhino is a threat, a risk that is in full view, right? It's not a black swan. We talked about black swans after the financial crisis in 2008, and that's only visible in a rear view mirror, right? A grey rhino is like coming straight at you down the road. It's big, it's lumbering, and it's coming at you, and you don't do anything about it. We were warned as an international community, as individual nations, about the threat of a zoonotic pandemic risk. We were actually explicitly warned about the nature of a respiratory novel virus risk as a pandemic threat from a zoonotic, i.e. jumping from an animal to humans. And of course, we'd been through a number of these in the last decade. So that warning was there from the WHO, from the World Bank, from the international community that had looked at this issue, in particular as it was after the Ebola crisis that broke out in 2014. Climate is a grey rhino. We are being warned almost on a weekly basis with new science and with new understanding of the impacts that are already being felt. And yet we don't get out of the way and we don't stop the rhino. So I think that learning about how we have and have not responded to COVID and where the resilience or the lack of resilience in our systems, our energy systems, our food systems, our financial systems as a result of a pandemic, when the climate risk in some regards is much, 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 much greater, gives us real data and information about how much more we are going to have to invest in our resilience to be able to cope with climate. The second thing, and I'll stop after this one, is that the COVID crisis has ripped a Band-Aid off the large, open, seeping wound of inequality, right? I mean, we live in a very unequal world, and that inequity and the inequality has been laid bare. Also then, our understanding even more deepened by the killing of George Floyd and the sort of international understanding around racial equality and justice that has emerged at the same time. So now that we hopefully can't look away from that inequality anymore, we also understand that our resilience depends upon the wellness of the weakest and the situation of the most vulnerable amongst us. You cannot self-isolate from a pandemic very easily, and you certainly can't self-isolate from climate. So I think there are two ways in which, there are many more, but those are two that I would really want to bring to everybody's attention.
the thing with COVID is that there's expected to be a vaccine. There's no vaccine for climate change. It relies totally on changing of institutions and people's behaviors.
Yeah, and also, if you think about the cause of COVID, right? So zoonotic diseases and zoonotic disease spread from animals to humans is more likely as we encroach further and further and further onto nature and into spaces where we as a species have no right really to be. The response to that is not about shutting down wet markets or about ending illegal wildlife trade, although those are things that may be responsible public policy responses. The real response to that, and one which is determined also by our need to be more resilient to climate change, is to embrace nature's natural resilience and to make nature and nature-based solutions a very big part of how we think about our economic well-being going forward and how we respond to climate change. So putting nature at the heart of things has been illustrated by COVID and is already a very, very big part of how we respond to climate.
Right. So there's co-benefits of protecting natural working lands and open spaces for both challenges, to address both challenges.
Absolutely.
So, okay, great. And so what are some of the other strategies that countries and subnational jurisdictions can employ to recover from the pandemic and build back better and ensure that the strategies are the best investments for maximizing environmental, economic, and social benefits?
Well, this is where I think there's actually good news. Right? So we must be daunted by the extent of the economic crisis brought about by COVID, right? We have more countries whose economies are shrinking at the same time than ever before in economic history. So this is daunting, but there is a pathway through this. There's a critical pathway which will allow us to create those good quality local jobs which are desperately needed in the very, very short term because everybody's hurting, but which will be part of an economy which is clean, an economy which spurs us onto the right trajectory for decarbonisation, and an economy which is, gives us a chance to be more inclusive. So, for example, our energy system is not really fit for purpose, right? We weren't on track for the decarbonisation that we needed. And then the collapse in the oil price and the fact that the oil price will not really ever get back to a point where the viability of certain companies is going to be determined. This became a very big part of the front end of the crisis, right? So in April, we were all looking at this collapse in energy demand and the collapse in energy prices, in oil prices as a result. Well, as we build back better, we know that some of the really good quality local jobs can be created by focusing on energy efficiency of our buildings. The renewable energy sector has proven to be much more resilient than the fossil fuel part of the energy sector. So imagine if we can, both at the local level and at the national level, incentivize and add stimulus to a massive effort to be much more energy efficient. It's not sexy, but there are good quality jobs there, jobs that are local, jobs that are needed now, and it will help us manage our energy demand, and it will make us closer to the pathway of decarbonisation of our energy system that we need for the climate crisis. You can also build much more livable houses as a result of that deep refurbishment, and we now know, after on the East Coast living through extraordinary heat over the last 2 months, and with heat waves all around the world, we're just getting hotter, and extreme heat is an issue. So, these are win-win-wins, right? Short-term jobs helps us become more efficient, helps us transition to the energy system. And it's been very interesting to me to watch, like, the International Energy Agency and the International Monetary Fund looking at a energy response to and part of the recovery from COVID, and coming out with a whole series of recommendations of where we can actually hit that sweet spot between short-term recovery and long-term trajectory towards a decarbonised society. So that's just one idea. I think the other ones are our food system, which we know is unsustainable from a planetary perspective, but it's also a food system which means that the only affordable food is bad food for many, many low-income people around the world. That food system has proven to be very irresilient as well. And so, where are the jobs that can be found in, looking at local food production for food that people need to eat that can be affordable. And that brings us back to some of the recommendations that have been made from a climate perspective, which is that, community composting and community waste reduction and attacking food waste. And there are jobs and there are businesses that can be built as we try to move our food system to a more sustainable footing as well. So I think one of the lessons of resilience is that you need to be able to operate locally as well as globally. So we need global solutions, we need national energy grids, but we also need local energy sustainability. We need interconnected global food chains, but we need to be able to be locally healthy. And so I think there's room for cities and counties and towns to rethink where those resilient, good quality local jobs are going to come from as we build back better, but as we put ourselves on the right track towards a climate resilient economy.
Wonderful. So you've described some challenges facing us now with not only COVID, but climate change, but also some opportunities for building a better future and a more sustainable future. What gives you hope as you move forward in your work?
Well, the hope comes from, so I would always describe myself as a hopeful pessimist. And my hope comes from the fact that, people do come together. And if you look around the world, the countries that have responded best to this crisis are countries that have a high level of social trust within communities, within society, and between society and government. And in situations like that, leaders have been able to stand up and say, you know what, we're all in this together. We don't have every answer, but if we work together, we can do this and we can find every answer that we need. So you look at Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, you look at Mette Frederiksen in Denmark. Oh, and guess what? Both young female leaders. We'll leave that for another day. But so we know that where we can build social trust and we have honest, transparent leadership, we can do this. And so that is a model, and that gives me hope because I think that can be replicated everywhere.
Well said, Rachel. Thank you so much for joining me this morning, and I look forward to meeting you in person sometime in the near future, hopefully.
Amy, it's always lovely to talk, and I can't wait for that meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe. Bye-bye.